Manager told me to call the person of the computer I was working on, so I did, by user sma1. Cross post from tech support. I was sitting in my office one slow day and the CEO walked in, always a pucker moment even though I'm on very good terms with him, and he handed me an, obviously non-business, laptop and asked if I could get it back up and running as it had very important thing on it that was needed shortly, and as I wasn't doing anything and he still signed my paycheck, I said, "You got it, sir." Later a middle mangler comes in and asks me to do something and I say, "You're number 2 in line," and pointed to the, obviously not corporate, laptop I was fixing. Mangler didn't like that much and demanded I call whoever and tell them that it wasn't acceptable for me to be working on personal equipment. So I pulled out my cell and called. Mangler could only hear my half of the convo, but what he heard was something like, "Hey Tom, I got Bob here telling me it isn't acceptable for me to be working on your personal stuff and he wanted me to call you and tell you." "Oh sure, he's right here, hang on." And I handed the phone to the mangler. Mangler started off saying it's not acceptable. And then his eyes got real big and the rest of the conversation was yes sir and no sir. He hung up and thundered, "Why didn't you tell me it was CEO's laptop?" And I said, "You didn't give me a chance," and demanded I call them right now. "You don't want me to work after I put in my 2 weeks, okay?" By user mother practice 1572. So when I was in my early 20s I worked at a well-known sandwich franchise. I actually really liked my job and I would open and close. I'd also come in whenever anyone called out because I lived 5 minutes away. One day my boss hires a new person, no big deal, except my boss kept cutting my hours more and more and giving them to the new person. I went from working 30 plus hours a week to working less than 15. Oh, and I was training them. So after a few months of my hours getting cut but me still coming in whenever called, I put in my 2 weeks. My boss proceeded to not schedule me a single hour after that. QMC, one of my co-workers who would call in regularly, didn't come in to open the store at 6 a.m. I drove by at 11 and it was still dark. My old boss had called me to ask if I could open for her. Nope, you didn't want to give me any hours after I put in my 2 weeks, figure it out. Well, I drove by that store for a couple weeks and wouldn't you know it was only open half the time. The new fence, by user bike 8R. TL, DR, friend was building new fence. Neighbor disputed property line, despite being told old fence was definitely on my friend's property by at least a foot, and called for a survey. They lost about 800 sq4 of their yard, had to move flower beds and retaining walls because it was about 10 feet onto my friend's property. Recalling this story made my heart smile, grinning face with smiling eyes. A few years ago, I was building a new fence for a friend of mine. I had to remove the old sections that were falling apart, first, of course, and when I got to the intersection of his back fence, his side fence, and the next door neighbor's back fence, I carefully separated the neighbor's fence from his, and proceeded to carry on removing the side sections that went between their two properties. My friend had told me that the side section was 100% on his property, and that the previous owner, 30 plus years ago, had deliberately given the next door neighbor's property an extra foot or so, to ensure that he was building on his own property, without calling for and paying for a survey. The neighbor, Susan, whom I will refer to as Karen for the remainder of this story, came running outside screaming at me that I couldn't remove the side fence and it was their property and just what do I think I'm doing? I responded back, very calmly, that my friend had told them well in advance that he was going to replace the fence, that he was just going to build it in the same place as the old one, and asked if they were willing to split the costs, to which they declined. No biggie. Karen started screaming at me again, telling me I had no right to do that, and that my friend didn't give them proper notice, and that she didn't realize that there wouldn't be anything between their two properties to contain their dog. By now, I'm about ready to lose my shit, so I knocked on my friend's back door to let him know what was going on, and that he needed to talk to Karen, and that I was leaving because I didn't want to do or say anything I would regret, or cause problems with the neighbors for my friend. The entire project got put on hold, pending a property survey that was going to cost $650, and that they demanded my friend pay half of, despite him telling them that the fence was definitely on his property, and nothing was going to change with the new fence, and that he was fine with them continuing to have a foot or so of his property, so that he didn't have to rock the boat. Fast forward to the following Monday when the surveyor comes out. Turns out, the old side fence was not a little on my friend's property, but almost 10 feet onto his property, and the neighbors had built up raised flower beds and done a nice brick retaining wall right up along the fence line, that they had spent a lot of money just in materials for, never mind the time they put in constructing it. Needless to say, my friend came away with the biggest shit-eating grin. For the mere price of $325, he was entitled to expand his yard of more than 30 years, by about 800 square feet, and Karen and her husband, who happened to be the polar opposite of his wife in personality, and was super nice, spent the next week moving their garden, retaining wall and all of the dirt that was on my friend's property, so that I could build the fence on his side of the actual property line. They then hired the cheapest contractors they could find to slap up a fence on their side of the property line. They spent almost as much as my friend did on their new fence. I gave my friend the friends and family discount. 3 years later, the last 20 feet or so of their fence is on the ground already, because it was such a shitty job that it fell over in a moderate windstorm this past spring. My friend's fence is still standing, rock solid, and his dogs are definitely making good use of the extra 800 SQ Fort grinning face with smiling eyes. I got rid of them, boss, just like you asked, by use run confirmed rooster. Short and simple one today, shouldn't need a TLDR hopefully. This took place where I work at a funeral home. We had several sets of straps for our lowering device, the thing that slowly lowers a coffin into the ground, and orders came from one of the managers to get rid of all the sets we had as new ones were coming in. I tried to protest that the new ones had arrived and were already in rotation, but was ignored. Gather up all the straps and get rid of them. Sir, yes sir. Initially I was instructed to throw them out, but I asked to keep them instead. I was told that they had to leave the premises one way or the other. So I took them and gave them to a friend of mine for safekeeping. A month later, I have that same manager come up to me asking how many sets of straps we have. I reply with none. He asks about the new ones that had come in. I inform him that they left the premises a month prior as per his instructions. He flies into a panic and is about to berate me for throwing them out when I tell him to relax, I can bring them back in. Bring them back in the next day, no harm and no foul. Certainly bruised that manager's ego a bit and made him think about what he says next time though. Edit, grammar. The car is a disgrace, by user Bacon Lasagna Shrimp. I've been wanting to get this off my chest for years. Our company had a modest sedan that was provided to a coworker and me to use as needed if we had a task in the field. I always kept it clean, whereas my coworker would leave trash and personal items in it. One fateful day the regional manager came to visit. The boss took him to a current project using the car. Needless to say the car was a mess. I hadn't used it in over 2 weeks. Boss got an attitude with me because the car was filthy. I'm an engineer, not a car wash employee. He then put out a memo stating the car was a disgrace and henceforth will be kept clean and that anything not belonging in the car needed to be thrown away before it was returned. The tone he took was insulting and demeaning. The next time I used the car was a week or so later after the boss had used it. When I was getting back in to return I noticed a set of keys barely visible between the seat back and seat. I retrieved it and realized it was my boss's key ring. In the many years that have passed since, I have come to feel it was wrong to toss the keys in the trash. I confess that was childish of me. Still, part of me is glad I did it.